So welcome back to the Zelda Game Club, where we play through the Legend of Zelda games as a Triforce Times community. This is the first Zelda Game Club focused on one of the most divisive Legend of Zelda games in the series, and that is Zelda II, The Adventure of Link. Well, today we're going to wrap up the first Zelda Game Club, making our way through the final palaces, and I'm going to tell you what I thought, plus I'll add in some community comments from those who played through the game and wrote in. Well, if you're new around here or find this useful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below for all the latest Legend of Zelda content and turn on notifications by hitting that bell. Well, before I get stuck into part 2 of the Zelda Game Club for the Adventure of Link, I want to send a massive thank you to everyone who played through the game and took the time to send in their comments. It is a big amount of time. The game took about 9 or 10 hours for me to get through, and that is no small task. So this is a huge thank you to everyone who played through the game, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Okay, so let's kick off part 2 with a couple of community comments. And the first one is from Ekana, and they say the difficulty really ramped up after sailing to Eastern Hyrule, so not a fan of Tektites in this game. It's interesting to note that all but one of the towns in the game has the same name as the sages in Ocarina of Time. Both Kasutos are strange towns, one being abandoned and the other being hidden in a forest, and I'm sure there's a bunch of theories out there regarding them. That comment came from Ekana, and thank you, Ekana. Really appreciate you writing in. Well, next comment, I've just completed the game, and this game was hard, and without the rewind option I think it would take me about a year to complete. My favourite boss is the dragon in the Hidden Palace. It's not too hard and not too easy, and that comment comes from Bombs of Coffee. And again, Bombs of Coffee, thank you so much for playing through. Really appreciate you taking the time to do that, and also write in with your comments. Well, going back to Akana's comments, so yes, the difficulty sure did ramp up as soon as we got over the water on that raft to Eastern Hyrule. And that was a really good spot about the names of the towns, being the same as sages in Ocarina of Time. I did find a good article called A Link Between Sages and Towns. I recommend checking out that article, and I'm going to link it down there in the description. It's really interesting because Zelda II came out first in the 80s, followed by Ocarina of Time in the 90s, and then regarding the Zelda timeline, Ocarina was where the timeline split into 3, with Zelda II coming afterwards. Therefore the towns are named after the sages, and I would imagine the writers of the game wanted to provide a thematic link between the games. But again, really good spot, Ekana. I like the fact that you saw that. In terms of Kasuto and New Kasuto, I really love that idea. Finding New Kasuto with the hammer, it was a really good secret to uncover. So going back to Bombs of Coffee's comment, so as for completing the game without a rewind button, I can't really imagine playing the game without modern conveniences. So I held off from the rewind feature until the final level, but I do have to admit I used the rewind feature through the Great Palace and also on that final boss. So that would have been so hard on the original NES. If you played through it without that rewind feature, I salute you and you have my utmost respect. The dragon was indeed one of the best bosses. I didn't think the dragon was quite as tough as the boss before in the Ocean Palace. That guy with the mace, he was rock solid. But I definitely agree with you, Bombs of Coffee. The dragon, he was a really good boss. It was a well animated boss as well, and he definitely offered up a decent challenge with Link jumping between those platforms. Okay, so with those comments kicking us off, let's dive into part 2 of Zelda II and the Adventure of Link. Well, we left things off in the first part of the Zelda Game Club, having beaten the Island Palace, and we just got the raft, meaning we could now continue our adventure over on the east of Hyrule. First thing to do here then is cross the river and head to the town of Nabooru, and here you pick up some water from the fountain to give to the elderly woman, who in turn leads you to the old man so you can get that fire spell. It's weird, I don't actually remember using the fire spell too much throughout the game, but let me know down in the comments if you use that fire spell. Having got that spell, it's then time to head north, through the caves and towards the Maze Island. There's a few items here, including the magic container, plus you got the lost child. There's loads of random battles there as well, so make your way to the east and you're going to find that lost child, and he's going to be important when you want to go to the next town. Also, if you're watching this in the future, make sure you don't miss any of the magic containers. I reached a point later on in the game where I was expected to have all of the magic containers and basically I was gated off from some of the content, and I had to go back and get all the magic containers, and that did take me a little bit of time, and if I just got all the magic containers as I was going along, that would have been much easier for me. So once you've found that lost child in the maze, it's a good idea to leave and make your way to the mounted town of Darunia, and here you're going to learn the upward strike with the sword. That's going to help you in the battles, as well as getting around without taking damage. You'll also get another spell in this town, a very useful one for the rest of the game, and that is Reflect. And now you've got your hands full with new spells and attack techniques, it's time to go to the Maze Palace. First of all, let's check in on the community comments, with one from Bombs of Coffee, and he says the sword moves really help with the difficulty of the game, but I would like it if the game had another sword instead of having to level up and upgrade the attack damage. Well, Bombs of Coffee, I really like the idea of another sword. You know, while learning the new techniques is good and useful throughout the game, getting another sword would have been really, really cool. Now, this is something we did see in the first Legend of Zelda game. Towards the end of that first NES game, you do get another sword, and that is indicated by a different colour of sword. But here in Zelda II, The Adventure of Link, we only have one sword throughout the whole game. I did feel that Zelda II, The Adventure of Link, was stripped back. I don't know if this was due to the shorter development time, but Bombs of Coffee, I think it's a really good idea in terms of improving the game. Well, next up, let's check out that Maze Palace. So the Maze Palace really cranked up the difficulty when it comes to the enemies, and that included armoured Stalfos, both blue and red. You know, previously, we had blue knights as bosses, but they're now relegated to regular enemies, plus you've got to look out for the jumping enemies too. You know, the item in this palace, the boots, allows you to walk on water, so if you can find that item, getting back to the palace is nice and easy, as you can walk on the water, meaning you can miss most of the random battles in the maze itself, which is good because getting back to the palace after dying at a crucial point is always really, really frustrating. And the boss in the Maze Palace is Korok. You know, it would be very difficult if you had to move around, although there is a way to cheese this boss by sitting in the corner and using that Reflect spell. So the next palace is very, very close. There's little in the way of adventures to be had before we get into it. All we have to do is go back through the cave and to that midpoint of Eastern Hyrule. Then you can use your newly acquired boots, go over the water and find that Ocean Palace. But before we do that, let's check in on the community comments and go over to Akana. And Akana says, I felt like this half of the game is really where the combat clicked for me. Now, the combat was still difficult and felt a bit unfair, but I felt like I had a better grasp on the flow of the game in general. The Maze Palace was actually pretty easy thanks to Korok, and the Ocean Palace and Guma are a different story though. That guy caused me a lot of grief. So I definitely agree with that one, Ikana. The Maze Palace was a little bit easier, definitely helped by that boss fight, and you're right about the next couple of palaces though. They are absolutely no joke. I think you're right, once you get into the combat flow and understand the sword and shield fighting techniques, the game does become much more enjoyable. I would say I enjoyed the second half of the game much more than I enjoyed the first half of the game. Well, next up we got the Ocean Palace, and the Ocean Palace once again increases the level of difficulty mainly due to the frequency of the blue iron knuckles and also the boss as well. The item in this palace is the flute, and that is one that's going to help you traverse Hyrule, so we need this one to help remove the big monster from the road, plus reveal the hidden palace that's after this. So this boss in the Ocean Palace is one of the harder bosses in the game. This boss is called Guma, and he has a deadly mace, so get too close and he's going to whack you with it. So you have to make sure you're light on your feet. Well, with this one, I definitely found using the magic spell Jump really useful. So as with many of the bosses and enemies in the game, you really have to be patient. So if you run in and get too excited, then you're going to likely lose all your coordination and probably will die. The best thing to do is take it slow and pick your shots against Guma, and then victory will be yours. Well, the build up to the next palace is a fairly long journey, given we have a whole new area of Hyrule to explore. That includes finding the magic key, you've got another magic container and also a new spell, plus we have an eerie town where everyone seems to have left, plus a new secret town to find. Well, the first big obstacle in our way is the River Devil, and you play the flute to remove him from your path. So head down the path in front of you and you'll find the Lizalfos, and they are the rock throwing variant, which are very tricky, and they're also very accurate with their rocks as well. We also have fire throwing scorpions and other Lizalfos as well, although these ones just have the traditional spears. Well, the best thing to do here is head north through the cave and to New Kasuto, and to find New Kasuto you have to clear an area of trees with a hammer on the overworld map, and the surprise and the delight when you first find that town having cleared all the other areas with the trees, that is pretty special. Once you get into the town itself, it's a good town to be in because of the number of items that it has. First of all, you have to have enough magic containers to get into the house, where the elderly woman then informs you there's a secret at the edge of town. You will also learn a new spell, so given the proximity of learning this new spell, with the secret at the edge of town, they naturally go together. So say the magic word at the edge of town, or use the spell, and it reveals a secret building where you find the magic key. That is an item that negates the need for smaller keys found in the palaces. That's going to be really useful in the next palace, the Hidden Palace, as there's actually no keys in that palace. Well, to get to the next palace, we have to call on a previous item, and that one is the flute. So play the flute at the 3 rock formation in the southeast of Hyrule, and that is going to reveal the Hidden Palace. Well, the Hidden Palace is really good fun and brings back some enemies that we've seen before in the game. Our good friend, the Blue Knight on horseback, who was a boss in the 3rd palace, the Island Palace. He's back, this time as a regular enemy. Given we are a little bit more powerful thanks to leveling up, he's much easier to fight this time. You got whiz robes, they are all over the place in this palace, so make sure you have Reflect on hand, as that is going to be the only way to beat them. Well, the cross is the item in this palace, which is going to make invisible enemies visible in the future, and there is an interesting puzzle here in this palace. So fall down a particular hole and you won't die. You're going to go into a loop. We have to find the right one to exit. Once again, without a guide, this one would have been near impossible to test or find. On modern consoles, you have a way to rewind if you die. Back in the day, there was no rewind feature, no internet to look up solutions, only a Nintendo hotline which charged by the minute. No wonder they made a whole bunch of money. After fighting our blue knuckle on horseback again, and some nifty platforming as the fairy, and it's time to face the boss of this palace, which is Barber. So this is a dragon who comes out of the lava and proceeds to shoot fire at you. Once again, patience is needed, but this boss isn't too difficult. Dispose of the dragon, and it's on to the final palace. Well, the final palace goes down as one of the hardest things that I've done in gaming. The rest of the game is really only building up to this moment, and the journey to that great palace through the Valley of Death. It's a really tough affair and, to be honest, an absolute grind. But we're so close to it's no time to give up now. Before you get into the Valley of Death, you have to get one more spell, and that is the Thunder spell. And this one is the most powerful spell in the whole game, and also the key to defeating the final boss. Well, the Valley of Death is a great description of what you're going to be going through, and it took me a few goes and a few hours to get there in one piece. Your reward for getting through the Valley of Death, though, is the Great Palace, which is not only good fun, plus you'll start again at the beginning of the Great Palace if you die, rather than going back to the start of the game next to Princess Zelda. This benefit is offset against the difficulty of the Great Palace itself, with new enemy types around almost every corner, and while the journey to the Great Palace is long, don't give up because the end of the game is in sight. Okay, so next let's have a look at the Great Palace and kick off with a community comment from Ekana. So the Great Palace beat me down over and over again. That thing was long and arduous, although I don't think Thunderbird was as bad compared to some of the other bosses. Dark Link was really hard for me, and I had to resort to the crouching in the corner trick to beat him. So I totally agree, Ekana, that was a long palace, and when I beat Thunderbird, I think I let out an audible yell. I found Thunderbird really tricky, and Dark Link was a massive surprise for me, and I did the same. I resorted to standing over by one side and slashing until Dark Link was defeated. I had very little energy left in my fight with Thunderbird, and I was just mashing the button hoping Dark Link wouldn't be able to damage me. Well, let's go on over to another community comment from Bombs of Coffee, and they say, I do like the palaces, the music is great and the bosses are good, although the last palace took me a while because I forgot the Thunder spell. A remake would be cool, although I don't know what it would be like. Oh man, getting all the way to the boss and then not being able to use that Thunder spell, that must have been a real kick in the teeth. But Bombs of Coffee, I'm really glad you stuck with the game and beat that boss. I too would love to see a remake, although I'm not really sure how it would work either. Personally, I would love to see an anime version art style, similar to the opening of Link's Awakening. Well, the Great Palace has loads of new enemies, including the Fokka, which is spelled F-O-K-K-A, and they're jumping enemies who shoot blades and come in red and blue variants. There's also jumping and fire-breathing enemies too. All in all, the enemies in this palace, they're new, they're tough, and they're not happy to see you. While this is a tough palace, I think it is a fitting end to the game. Well, there's no item in this palace, given it's the final palace, but we have 2 final bosses. Going into that final boss fight is a good idea to have a great amount of health, as when you get through the first boss, that is Thunderbird, and then you've got the ultimate test, that is Dark Link. Dark Link is definitely one of my favourite characters or concepts in the whole of the Legend of Zelda series. So when you first run into the final boss, you have to use the Thunder spell, otherwise the boss is immune to damage. Thunder takes loads of your magic, so it's a good idea to level up your magic as much as possible. It goes to level 8. I did manage to beat the boss with a level 6 magic, so it is possible, but I would recommend getting more magic and leveling that up, as anything to make your life easier for the final boss is going to be really, really useful. Thunderbird hovers around the screen, shoots out fireballs, and they cannot be blocked, only dodged, and the more you damage Thunderbird, the more fire they spit out, making it very, very hard to survive towards the end. But beating Thunderbird is a massive thrill, and then when you think you've done it to get your hands on the Triforce of Courage, unfortunately this success is short-lived, because the little imp with the Triforce runs away, and Dark Link appears instead. And so Dark Link could be a tough battle, although once again there is a cheese for Dark Link where you can stab from the side of the screen. Now I would have loved to run around the screen and fight Dark Link. I had such little energy left from fighting Thunderbird, so it's going to be really, really hard to go all the way back to the beginning of the level. Now I just didn't want to die to Dark Link. So once you defeat Thunderbird and Dark Link, that is it, you get the Triforce of Courage, and congratulations, you have completed the game. Well then, we get a nice cutscene where Link holds the Triforce up in front of Princess Zelda. This wakes her up and she says, "You've saved Hyrule, and you're a real hero." The curtain closes, she hugs Link, and then the credits roll. Well, let's go over to another community comment from Ekana. So they say, having beaten the game, a goal of mine since I was a kid, I still say that Adventure of Link is one of the worst Zelda titles. It has its good parts and introduced mechanics to the series that would become staples for years to come, like magic, but I do think that it is overhated. Had it come out in a different era of gaming, I think it would have done quite well. Well, the princess is saved and Hyrule is secure. Can't wait for A Link to the Past. Well, thank you once again, Ekana, for writing in and also completing the game, and the fact that it was a goal of yours since you were a kid. I'm really, really pleased that you played along with us. That is definitely one of the goals of the Zelda Game Club. So compared to other Zelda titles, it's definitely not up there with the best of them, like Breath of the Wild, Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past. They are some of my favourites. I also love Wind Waker. I would love more people to be able to play this game, and I sometimes think the NES style puts off a lot of people. Both with this one and the original, I think they are well worth playing. Well, that is it for Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. That is the end of the game, and thank you so much for everyone for playing. It was an absolute pleasure playing through with you, and I really, really enjoyed going back to Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. Well, as part of the Zelda Game Club, I also want to bring you some interesting facts about Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. So I have a few here about the development, the reception, and also the legacy of the game as well. Well, let's dive into some more facts about the development. So with this one, a new team was put together for the second Legend of Zelda in the series, although Miyamoto himself provided some continuity, and he is credited under the pseudonym Miyahon. Takahashi Tezuka wrote the story, and there was also 2 directors for the game, Tadashi Sugiyama and Yasuhisa Yamamura, and the wonderful music of the game is down to composer Akito Nakatsuka. And the game was originally released on the Japan-only Famicom computer disk system before it was released worldwide. In 1988, there was a shortage of ROM chips, which held Nintendo back from releasing the game on its original schedule. Parallels could be drawn to 2022, with a shortage of parts to make Nintendo Switch consoles, and could be behind the delay of Breath of the Wild 2, but we're only going to find this out sometime in the future, so this is a nice time capsule for when Breath of the Wild 2 comes out, and hopefully we'll find out more about that development history. Well, the Famicom Disk System version release was an early build of the game, with all of the palaces being the same grey colour, whereas in the final release in the Western version, they had all of their own distinct colour palettes. 2 bosses even had different sprites, Karok and Barber. Well, let's talk a little bit about the reception next. So when it was first released in North America, it was met with mostly positive reviews and became one of the most popular NES titles of 1988. Famitsu, over in Japan, gave it 36 out of 40, making it the second highest rated title in 1987, behind Dragon Quest II. Nintendo Power said it was an entertaining and natural step in the franchise's evolution and gave it Game of the Year in 1988. Well, winding forward now to 1997, Electronic Gaming Monthly listed Zelda II as number 72 on the 100 Best Games of All Time list, saying that the other then-released Zelda titles, The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening, they were all better, and they actually all placed in the top 30. In 2008, Nintendo Power listed it as the 12th best NES game, describing it as a radical and refreshing departure from the original. Well, it's interesting to see there that even though when it first came out it had mostly positive reviews, actually after a few years, it's only number 72 on 100 best games of all time, and then the 12th best NES game of all time. So it does show time hasn't been very kind to Zelda II: The Adventure of Link. Well, next up, let's have a look at the legacy of the game. So Zelda II introduced features that would live on in other Zelda games. For example, a wide variety of NPC characters with their own stories and world building, and these NPCs appear to have their own lives and also help Hyrule seem more alive, rather than everything being set up for Link. A magic meter was introduced here too, which would live on in other Zelda titles, and also the Triforce of Courage is first introduced here, which would appear in other Zelda games and is generally associated with Link. This is also the first time we meet Dark Link after the final boss battle, and Dark Link would return in Ocarina of Time, also in the Four Swords Adventures, plus Spirit Tracks and also A Link Between Worlds. And as Ikana pointed out earlier, most of the sages in Ocarina of Time bear the same names as the towns in the Adventure of Link, so Raoru, Ruto, Saria, Naburu and Darunia, and the town of Mido shares the name of a character in Kokori Forest. So while there are some small side-scrolling parts in Link's Awakening, the series went back to a top-down version in the Legend of Zelda series, made famous by that first entry. Nintendo then transitioned to 3D with Ocarina of Time in 1998 for the N64. Well, that is it for Zelda II: The Adventure of Link, and also our first Zelda Game Club. And thank you once again if you played through the game with us. You know, games, they're always better when you can share that experience with someone, and knowing that others were going through the same when I was going through the tough moments here really made it better. Also, I love reading through the community comments, and I hope in the future we can get more of the community involved and keep playing through the Legend of Zelda series together. You know, next up is going to be A Link to the Past, one of the best games of all time, and I don't have an exact time for that one just yet. It's likely when I get back from holiday later on in September 2022. You know, rather than start the game and then stop for a break, I'd like to play the game all the way through with no breaks, that way it is fresh in our minds. But don't worry, I'm going to put out a video announcing the next Zelda Game Club very soon, and I'll give everyone a good bit of notice. So make sure you share this and tell your friends about the Zelda Game Club. You know, anyone who is interested in the Legend of Zelda series, I'd love you to get involved and you can play through with the Triforce Times community. I'd also love your feedback on this Zelda Game Club. You know, what did you like? What didn't you like? Was it too short? Was it too long? So I would imagine the next Zelda Game Club is going to be longer, i.e. more parts to the series, because the games are longer too. Now, Legend of Zelda games on the NES, they are quite short, somewhere between 5 and 10 hours. Once we get into the bigger games, the Zelda Game Clubs, they will likely have more parts. For example, this Zelda Game Club had 2 parts. I would imagine A Link to the Past would have at least 4, but I'm going to have to see when working that one out. But do let me know down in the comments your feedback for this Zelda Game Club. Yeah, it really helps me out to know what works and what doesn't work about these, so please let me know in the comments. This is supposed to be a community feature, so your input is really valuable. And I definitely want to make sure that we're shaping this Zelda Game Club together as a community. Well, that is it for this Zelda Game Club for Zelda II: The Adventure of Link. And as always, thank you so much for watching or listening. For more Legend of Zelda content like this, hit that subscribe button down below and subscribe to Triforce Times. Or you can check me out on Twitter at Triforce Times. Well, if you enjoyed this video, found it useful, liking and sharing the video would really help me out. Otherwise, check out the other videos on the channel. Well, thanks again, and I'll see you very, very soon.